So now we're going to present Chad's presentation, Chad Stevens. And I think we have the recording going. He's getting the slides up. And take it away, Chad.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So microphone's working good. Now, whenever you see my slides, you're not also seeing my presenter view. Is that correct?
Correct. They look great.
All right. Sounds good. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chad Stevens. I'm a rising 3L from the Florida State University College of Law. And today I will be presenting on Florida environmental law with a focus on agricultural resilience to natural disasters. So, firstly, before we get into the law, I would like to start with a little project overview and some of the goals that I think should be highlighted before we jump into the substantive part of the presentation. While my presentation covers much of Florida environmental law, it's important to highlight that most of my research was through the lens of agricultural and resilience to natural disaster hooks that were embedded in the project goals. And that will shape much of what I'm going to be highlighting today. The research focused on state law, not local or federal law, to narrow the scope of the project. What I cover will rub up against those entities in some spots, but the focus is on the state law. With the dense amount of information that we were sifting through for this project, I made sure to be intentional and thorough with my research. Of course, drafting a well-written memo is the ultimate goal of the project, with the purpose of informing the public about something that many may know very little about. The hope is that informing them will increase awareness and public participation and will lead to law that shows long-term planning and careful consideration of environmental effects. Another thing I'd like to address before getting into the law is a little bird's eye view of the state of Florida. Florida contains many diverse ecosystems, from the famous Everglades to the pine thrush forests of North Florida near Tallahassee, where I'm based out of. There are two climatic categories and zones within the state of Florida: a humid subtropical majority of the state, and then in the south, a tropical zone. We contain 1,350 miles of coastline, the most coastline in the contiguous United States by a significant margin. We have 1,700 rivers, nearly 8,000 lakes, and many, many miles of underground aquifers. This natural bounty comes with a constitutional protection of the environment in Article 2, Section 7 of the Florida Constitution, guaranteeing clean air, water, and land for all citizens of the state. Now I think it's important to highlight some of the agencies of the state of Florida. First is the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDEP. It's the state's lead agency for water resources, coastal protection, and environmental permitting. If you're looking at clean water standards or aquatic preserve protections, FDEP is likely involved. They are a real catch-all for all environmental issues in the state. And in all but a few exceptions, if there's an environmental issue present, FDEP will likely be involved. Next is the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. This department regulates fertilizer use, best management practices for water quality, and agricultural land conservation. Both are traditional agencies created from statute. Then we get into agencies with a little bit of a different legal position, like the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, which arises out of the Florida Constitution itself and is an independent commission shielded from political oversight. They oversee protected animals, grant recreational licenses for hunting and fishing, and oversee protected habitats and preserves. On the other end of that spectrum is the Division of Emergency Management, which is directly held in the office of the governor and oversees everything disaster related, from relief to projects that seek to mitigate future damage from disasters. And these are just a few of the agencies within Florida that I was able to list here. Other agencies, like the Department of Health, also play a role in some of the environmental issues in the state. Moving on to the broad range of law that was covered by this project, Florida environmental law is robust and it's expansive, and each has many different facets. My project seeks to map out this complicated web and get a better picture of the major happenings in each sector of the law and how they're changing. It's a lot. And even still, I want to save plenty of time for questions. So if you have some, make sure to keep note of them for the end of the presentation. With all that water that I mentioned earlier, it makes sense that Florida has extensive protections and programs for water in both quality and management. When it comes to management, there are 5 water management districts that help implement the expansion of access and help DEP with their permitting systems, from stormwater to consumption. There is a growing demand for water in the state, with consumption for development and agriculture expected to double by 2070. A growing population also means a population of citizens who will increase water usage. This means more wells, more wastewater plants, and more septic tanks, all of which need permits from the Department of Environmental Protection. Aquifers provide much of the potable water for the state, and so aquifer protection is also a critical feature for increasing access for citizens to get clean water. DEP has the regulations on the books to account for this expansion, but it will require the agency and the water management districts to be given the resources to tackle a real logistical challenge as Florida's population continues to explode. Water quality is also of great importance for the state. Quality is identified by areas of concern that are tracked by DEP, with monitoring reports submitted by those who have permits with the agency. Floridians can think of areas like Biscayne Bay or Lake Okeechobee as examples of areas of concern that received heightened protections and care due to their impairment. There are phenomena like red tide, which occurs when an oversaturation of nutrients in the water from fertilizer allows for mass algal blooms, which has created billions of dollars in environmental damage in Florida. Much effort has gone into reducing the concentration of phosphates and nitrates in Florida waters. Aquifer water quality has also been an important issue addressed by the Aquifer and Springs Protection Act. The Act creates basin management action plans, which help agencies improve water quality and restore water to safe levels. Having many, many miles of coastline and many residents who live on those coasts, our emphasis on coastline protection in the state of Florida cannot be understated. Sea level rise and erosion affect both coastal infrastructure and coastal habitats, and laws like the Florida Beach and Shore Preservation Act help fight against that. The law creates a line on the coast called the Coastal Construction Control Line that any structure built seaward of needs to meet heightened standards. These standards can include storm resistance, and they also cannot negatively affect the dunes and beaches that help prevent erosion on the coastline. Resilient Florida is a program that provides communities with funds for projects to help adapt and mitigate against sea level rise and flooding. While the law is reactive to the effects on the coastline caused by things like natural disasters, there seems to be a gap in the law if an eventual retreat from the coastline becomes necessary due to sea level rise. So, 20 minutes is a long time to present, and we're going to be going through a lot of law. So I want to give a little bit of a narrative recount of a cautionary tale in Florida's history that helps show why these laws are important and what changes in the law need to be made to prevent these sorts of disasters. So in 1928, the San Felipe Segundo hurricane, the worst hurricane in Florida history, made landfall. And poor water management and preparation caused catastrophic effects. The incident shows how all these issues that I'm discussing today are really interconnected. The story goes that around Lake Okeechobee, there were hundreds of farms that used dikes and canals in low-lying areas around the lake to divert water to their farms. These land management projects were taken on by the farmers themselves. There wasn't really any oversight from the state. There's no permitting process. And so this kind of webbing of dikes and canals meant that the flow of water from the lake was really easy, and it trapped itself within a little bubble around Lake Okeechobee. If you look on that map, those blue lines show that the hurricane flooded hundreds of miles around the edges of that lake. And it ended up killing over 2,500 people, sweeping homes, farms, and those estimated 2,500 people into the nearby Everglades, many of which were never found. So all the things that I'm discussing today, water management, emergency management, we're trying to prevent catastrophes like this, where a combination of factors, people's livelihoods of farming and water management, not being overseen by the government, can lead to a failure to prepare whenever it comes to disasters. So moving into Florida flora and fauna. Florida has many incredibly unique plants and animals that not only need protection, but help protect us from the severe damage that natural disasters can cause. Protections for seagrass and coral reefs are not only important because they provide habitats for marine life, but also because they can help to reduce the damages from inclement weather events. One of the biggest problems with the Lake Okeechobee disaster that I just mentioned was storm surge. And storm surge happens when a really violent natural event like a hurricane comes through. And the power engine for that hurricane is usually changes in water temperature that it receives as it passes over the ocean. That power then pushes water from the ocean, or in the case of Lake Okeechobee, from a lake onto land. And that water surges onto land and sweeps away anything in its path. Things like seagrasses, coral reefs, and mangroves help slow down that engine of power that a hurricane can receive and slows down the storm surge from going as far as possible onto land. Manatees help maintain a healthy coastline by grazing on those seagrasses and creating a balanced ecosystem. Mangroves, in particular, are one of the most important as they both break up storm surge, as I mentioned, and reduce erosion on the coastline. Each has laws protecting them, including the Manatee Sanctuary Act, which punishes boaters for speeding in designated areas, preventing boat strikes that lead to most of the fatalities for manatees, and regulating any activity that harms manatees. The Coral Reef Protection Act punishes boaters who anchor or strike reefs. The mangrove, the mangroves are protected under the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act, which does what it sounds like. It makes it illegal to trim mangroves and to otherwise uproot them. Seagrasses are protected through environmental resource permitting, which again goes through the Department of Environmental Protection, which also regulates another important natural feature of Florida, which is wetlands. So now on to agriculture. Agriculture plays a huge role in the economy of Florida. We are famous for many of our agricultural products, like oranges. The agricultural industry is heavily regulated when it comes to water usage and environmental protection. Fertilizer labeling and registration is managed by the State Department of Agriculture and sets forth usage for the industry. And best management practices and consumptive use permits determine how the land and water is used and maintained in agricultural settings. While there are regulatory tools to help limit fertilizer runoff, many argue that more is needed in order to prevent algal blooms and oversaturation of nutrients. Agriculture in the state requires careful planning and management in order to have the resources they need for success while also cultivating land in a sustainable manner. Emergency management, as I demonstrated with our story, is critical for protecting the lives of Floridians. If there had been a coordinated evacuation in the San Felipe Segundo hurricane, many lives could have been spared. And that is exactly what the Division of Emergency Management seeks to prevent. One of the most important tools of emergency management in the state of Florida is when the governor issues an executive order declaring a state of emergency. It enables emergency powers and decisive action, like emergency funding from the Emergency Preparedness and Response Fund. It also activates the division, which puts all of the state employees who work for the division on overtime to make sure that as much of the damage can be mitigated, is mitigated, and as many lives are saved as possible. They also, when not activated, develop different types of plans for disasters in different geographic locations within the state. While the project is limited to state law, it is worth mentioning that when an emergency occurs, cooperation between state, local, and federal actors is critical for affected areas to receive funding and for action to be efficient and timely. There are many programs and regulations in the state that deal with land management and protection. Florida acquires new conservation easements every year to expand the land used for habitats for wildlife. Florida also contains a wildlife corridor that allows for contiguous land borders that wildlife can use to travel from place to place in the state, especially helpful for migratory animals such as birds. Our forests not only create habitats for these animals, but they also serve as carbon sinks for the carbon released into the atmosphere. There are programs like the Florida Forever program and the Rural and Family Lands Conservation Act that continue to expand the amount of land protected for conservation purposes. Finally, going back to wetlands for a second, they're a big deal for the state of Florida. Florida is home to 1/5 of all of the wetlands in the United States, and they do everything from flood prevention, water purification, erosion control, and are a habitat for a wide array of species. I would be remiss to finish the presentation without mentioning that the political shift, both nationwide and in the state on environmental protection, has affected the language of many of the laws that I have mentioned today, and ones that I didn't have the time to mention. Senate Bill 1624 removes mention of climate change and emissions from basically all of the laws that concern the environment in the state. And this shift in language used to describe environmental problems and the laws that afford solutions has uncertain effects. The power of language and interpretation of statute is really important when it comes to the application of laws in particular cases. And it's yet to be seen how courts will interpret the laws that are on the books now that these changes have occurred, and whether or not these will be more of superficial changes or some real substance will be taken away from these laws because of the changes in language. To close, Florida's state level environmental legal system is both wide ranging and adaptable. It covers so much ground, and only a few interest groups and affected parties tend to be informed about environmental law outside of the legal community. Resilience requires not only good law on the books, but a culture of proactive planning, enforcement, and a long term vision for success for the state, not only with the legal stakeholders, but also with the public. Hopefully, my project can do the hard work to inform the public about what environmental law is and how to sit in on some of the crafting of environmental regulations. I can think back to my externship last summer at DEP, sitting in an old stuffy room in a rulemaking meeting and having basically no one there other than the staff at DEP and one or two interested parties. If we could fill up that room for every rulemaking, I'm certain that the law in Florida will reflect our values and be more thorough and even better than what we have now. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much. I also hope for full rooms. Thanks, Chad. Any questions for Chad? You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question.
I have a question for Chad. Kind of going off of your question that you asked Desiree earlier, did you find anything surprising in your research in Florida, being that you are a Florida native? Yeah, did you find anything in your research that surprised you, either good or bad?
Well, I would say that a lot of the bad stuff wasn't surprising because I'm like, it's very clear where the state of Florida politically is shifting. But I would definitely say that there was a lot that I didn't know just because Florida environmental law is so extensive. There's a bunch of rabbit holes that you can really fall down. And you almost get lost in the really extensive stuff that you see. But I would say the most surprising thing for me was the flora and fauna that we have. We're not just relying on the Endangered Species Act for everything, that we have our own kind of domestic laws that are specifically targeted at one species of animal or one species of plant. I thought that was really surprising, but I think it's also kind of hopeful. It shows that, Floridians really care about those species that we're known for and that we're willing to put pressure on the legislature to create an entire law just for that one animal. So I thought that was surprising and also very cool.
Thanks, Chad.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to give 30 seconds for anyone else to pop in with a question.
We have a question in the chat. So are there laws regarding agricultural runoff, like, for example, dumping? Are these strictly regulated, and if they are, by what department?
Yeah, so I would say that there are a few things that are kind of interacting when it comes to agricultural runoff. So first of all, you have kind of the beginning of that process, which is, the fertilizer labeling and registration aspects of it. And then you have the actual runoff portion of it. And that usually is going to be the NIPD's permits of point source pollution that are going to be overseen by the Department of Environmental Protection. So I'd say in the front, you have the Department of Agriculture, and then in the back end, you have the Department of Environmental Protection. And I would say strictly regulated, I think there are definitely some issues there. I mentioned before that permits, the checking of the water regularly is done by the permit holder. And so there's a little bit of an issue about, is this person biased, or are we doing enough of our due diligence whenever we come out and we inspect, to not just take their word for everything that they're saying about how clean the water is around their farm, and testing it ourselves and comparing the data and really and doing the due diligence. I've been on a stormwater permit inspection before with DEP, and I will say that it was really led by the permit holder, and the areas in which we inspected were led by the permit holder. And so I think there's a lot of control that the permit holder has that I think should be replaced with more oversight by the agency.
Good question. Thank you so much. Thanks, Chad. All right. Well, thank you. That was great.